Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you to MidCamp for inviting me to speak, and thanks to Avi for that introduction. Before I get started, I beg your indulgence for the next hour. As those of you who know me already understand, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I can really wonk out on some topics that I feel really passionately about. Lucky for all of you, Drupal is one of those topics. So with that, I welcome you to the economics of Drupal contribution. If you have any questions, there will be time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, the hashtag is MidCampD8 or MadCampD8 if you're crazy. So we'll just go with that. So hello, I'm Tiffany. Some of you may know me as the CEO of Palantir. A few of you might be aware that I'm the treasurer of the Drupal Association. And as I stand before you today, I bring with me both of those roles, but also, and perhaps more importantly, my role as an influential Drupal contributor. To look at my drupal.org page, you probably wouldn't have guessed that I have any impact on Drupal at all. I've been a member for 8 years, but I have 14 posts on d.o. I have no commits, no issues, no projects. In fact, I've never written a patch, written a module, or installed Drupal. So, however, there are things that I have done. Since 2010, I've been on the board of the Drupal Association, including serving as the treasurer and on the executive committee with Angie and Dries since 2011. I was the chair of DrupalCon Chicago in 2011. Anybody go? Yay! Big fan. And I've overseen thousands of lines of code, hundreds of patches, and dozens of modules commissioned by Palantir and by Palantir's clients. We have sponsored every North American DrupalCon since Boston in 2008, and provided speakers at every DrupalCon since Barcelona in 2007, and provided financial, logistical, and speaking support to too many camps and sprints to remember. So I'm very well versed in all the various and sundry ways that individuals and organizations contribute to Drupal, as well as why. Drupal's motto is come for the code, stay for the community. In my case, it's absolutely true, and I'm completely hooked. Palantir first used Drupal on a client project back in 2006, and then we dropped our own CMS in favor of Drupal in 2007. But what's most important is that when I attended my very first Drupal event, that happened in early 2008, little did I know that a seemingly straightforward technical decision would have such an important and profound impact on my life. Drupal welcomed me into a community that's become so important to me both socially and professionally. Drupal has given me a reason to be at events around the world and know people when I get there. So no doubt that's not an unusual experience. It probably feels that same way to all of you, or many of you. So one of my first exposures to Drupal in a social way occurred in February of 2008. Palantir hosted a data API design sprint. It was the earliest planning for what would end up becoming Fields and Core in Drupal 7, and actually paved the way for some of the entity API work that we're actually seeing in Drupal 8. Although, as Larry Garfield, aka Krull, likes to say, give or take about 15 iterations, right? So that sprint came together something like this. Identify the people that you need to be there, find a room, insert the essentials, food, beverages, Wi-Fi, plane tickets, and voila, important stuff happens, right? Targeted sprints such as this are very valuable and are still one of the most effective tools we use for strategic planning around specific topics. Sprints at DrupalCons and camps, nudge nudge, please go on Sunday, are also very helpful in onboarding new contributors and bug squashing in the issue queues. But that largely leaves execution to happen elsewhere. And we know that even core contributors who are working full-time for companies involved in Drupal, they do most of their Drupal 8 core contributions on their personal time in nights and weekends. I am very grateful for those who choose to do that, and let nothing in this talk persuade you otherwise. I will forever be grateful to the folks who volunteer to work on core. However, I would like to understand why, when so many people and so many companies are paid to work on and work with Drupal, the most important work in Drupal is still largely shouldered by volunteers in their free time. And I want to know how we can tweak it to make it better for the entire Drupal ecosystem. So here's where we're at. It is day 1,471 of the Drupal 8 release cycle. We've had over 2,700 contributors to D8, representing about 650 companies. Last month, we had 392 people solve 11 release blocking issues. 50 release blocking issues remain. If you go to drupalreleasedate.com, it predicts February 26th of 2016 as Drupal's predicted release. Now, I do not question their math. I understand how they get there, but no, just no. I can't believe that it will take us that long, but then again, I would never believe that we wouldn't already have D8 by now, right? But if they're right, that's a release cycle of 1,876 days. Nope, 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 nope. Clearly, our contribution model is strained. Drupal 8 contribution has become painful for too many, both those who work on core and those businesses and end users who want it, who need it, right? So to understand how open source contribution works and how we might influence it, I want to first examine the motivations for individuals and organizations who work within open source. Open source has established itself as a mainstream movement in software development, so a lot of study has been given to why individuals and organizations would prefer and do pursue open innovation. We should look first at a cost-benefit analysis from the perspective of a contributor. Any time spent on an open source project incurs an opportunity cost, basically the lost benefit that would have been gained by doing anything else. The benefit that open source work, long-term or short-term, intrinsic or extrinsic, must outweigh this opportunity cost for the project to be successful. So let's look at some common incentives, right? Learning and altruism. Those are the first two that kind of come to mind when you think about volunteering your time for something. You're either going to learn something new, so yes, of course it makes sense that would be a worthwhile use of your time, or you believe so passionately, so philosophically in the cause that you're happy to donate your time, and you think of it that way. The short-term extrinsic incentives are also really straightforward. I wrote this code because I needed it for my own use. Or I wrote this code because it helped me gain karma in a community that I care about, for the respect of people that I respect. As someone who's been in the community over 8 years, I find the long-term incentives particularly interesting. Contributors' skill level and corresponding motivation for participation changes over time. The socialization opportunities, like we have here today, are very, very powerful. The intrinsic long-term rewards like fun, intellectual stimulation, and a sense of obligation and reciprocity are the ones that drive retention in open source communities. However, social obligation alone results in below average contribution levels. The more seniority someone has in the community, the greater the expectation that there will be extrinsic benefit in the form of career opportunities, read money, right? That's not entirely opportunistic on their part. The quality and impact of senior contributions is higher and more concentrated, but those contributors are more sensitive to the other demands on their time, be it personal or professional. The opportunity cost for their contributions is much higher, so while these developers are so passionately and so largely committed, their work output just tends to be slower. I'm hoping that these incentives feel familiar, right? That they ring true, that you can see yourself and why you're here somewhere up there on that board. In addition, we find that motivations matrix holds for organizations as well. In a 2013 study of the Drupal community for his dissertation, Jonathan Sims found that taking from the community increases the productivity of a company. This confirms the use motivation at an organizational level. Giving code to the community leads to the development of social ties, but surprisingly, giving help does not. Reputation is earned in our community and other open source communities through code contributions, And increased reputation leads to long-term intrinsic motivations through socialization. He also found that the combination of taking and giving leads to more incremental innovations when considering giving code, but not for giving help. When firms both take and give help, the innovations are actually more radical in nature. So the more you work on code, the more your code is going to look like the code that you've worked with. But if you're talking to people about their problems, you're more likely to find an out-of-the-box solution. Socialization does not intrinsically trigger the long-term social obligation. It's actually more based on reciprocity. You wrote this code for me, you fixed this patch for me, I now feel like I need to fix this patch for you or write this feature for you. The interaction of taking and giving help actually leads to slower debug times. A little bit more research, right? So Drupal Association board member and UCSF professor Samir Verma and his colleagues devised a model for the open source development process. They looked specifically at what drives volunteerism that is so essential and is the lifeblood of any open source project. Their model that they developed considers many factors, including the size of the community, the relationships between the community members, their reputation, the payoff benefits over generations of development, and the impact it has on the individual's personal strategy for involvement. Their model finds that cooperation and socialization are the key to getting developers to trust and to work on random features or bugs that have little personal use value. They did not find that the volunteerism model wanes over the time with the size of the population. That's some good news. One of the other interesting insights I took from their research is that the number of releases, what they call generations, drives voluntary participation. So with the development of Drupal 8 entering its 5th year, that in particular gave me pause. Somehow, we've gotten away from release early and release often. The longer it takes for us to get the D8 release out, the harder it will be. We saw a similar phenomenon at the end of the Drupal 7 cycle, with a handful of key and exhausted people who needed to push the boulder up the hill toward the end. And here we are, again, roughly in the same spot for the final leg of Drupal 8. We have to stop this pattern. We have to do something differently, not just for now, but also make changes to mitigate this risk moving forward. The obvious answer, right, seems to be to increase the number of people paid to work on Drupal core by their employers. With the number of people and organizations who benefit from Drupal, it seems like this really should be easy. However, core contribution is difficult to incentivize for 2 reasons. One, the release cycle is just too long. As I showed in that incentive matrix, the reputational payoff benefit for core work is undermined by the length of the release cycle. Reputational motivation for a company or an individual has to be a short-term incentive. The other problem is that working on contributive modules has greater benefits and lower costs. So let's look at the Drupal 8 release cycle. We can see clearly from the trend, from one release to another, it's going up. 1,471 days, and we're not done yet. Looking to Linux as a model, what's important to note is in 2005, kernel development adopted a loose, time-based release model with a new major kernel release occurring every 2 to 3 months. Prior to that, their release times had begun to creep up in a pattern that was not dissimilar to ours, although their longest cycle was actually more comparable to Drupal 7. There's nothing like the timescale we're seeing on Drupal 8. Since they implemented that change, the rate of change in the kernel is high and increasing. They've had over 10,000 patches going into each of the recent kernel releases. And each of those releases contains the work of over 1,400 developers representing over 200 corporations. Perhaps some of this will be mitigated by semantic versioning that we're introducing for Drupal 8. Will it help shorten the Drupal 9 development cycle because we can now incorporate features and don't have to wait for D9? Maybe. I certainly hope so. So let's take for granted we are doing something on that front. So let's say it works. Let's assume that we are able to adopt regular short release cycles. Then we have to address the competition between work on core and work on contributed modules, aka contrib. It's already the case that more people are paid to work on contrib as part of their jobs than are paid to work on core. Most of Palantir's subsidized time goes to contrib, not to core. So let's think about what is different between the contributed module space and core. Well, first and foremost, any work in the contrib space has immediate use value. The release cycle is shorter, almost immediate if you're the maintainer or the writer. So there are much faster reputational gains as an organization or as a person. There are also increased career opportunities in contrib. It is much easier to get paid either directly for module work or to get hired full-time to a position that includes module work on company time and or for clients. Each contributed module is in a way its own ecosystem, much smaller than core and in code, right? So it's smaller in code and it's smaller in the number of contributors than core. This decreased size makes module issue queues much easier to navigate in comparison to core. In short, it's easier to align the individual motivations with the strategic needs of the contributor at this module level. The Drupal ecosystem has limited resources, and all but the most altruistic are going to choose to maximize their investment by working in contrib. Voluntary participation matters, even if individuals receive extrinsic benefit, like being paid directly for their contributions. Choosing to work on one feature over another, or contrib instead of core, is a strategic choice that has consequences both for the contributor and for the success of our project. Absent fairly significant enhancement of the benefit structure, or the emergence of a new set of exclusive strategic complements for Drupal-centered businesses, module contribution will remain a more advantageous avenue for Drupal contribution from the commercial ecosystem for the foreseeable future. Drupal, like any open source project, needs to be able to execute on this high priority work that might not otherwise be compelling to an individual or an organization to work on, but is nonetheless essential. This problem isn't unique to Drupal. Absent outside influences, the self-interest motivations of any open source contributor will not inherently lead to strategic outcomes. Open source is by its very origin self-interested and use-oriented, which makes it largely tactical and very focused on code. Scratch your own itch. That said, the good news is there is no shortage of vision or talent within our community, and each release we set very ambitious goals. However, aligning people, time, and resources to achieve those goals is the hardest part. That's where we've struggled. That's our problem. Drupal needs a strategic framework to improve our overall productivity and increase the benefits of contribution to individuals and organizations, and provide those resources directly when necessary. Strategic execution is a systemic challenge within open source communities. At our scale, this necessitates a system-wide institutional solution. That word, I keep using that word strategy in one form or another, 18 times so far, if anybody's keeping count. So perhaps it's time. All right, I'll introduce it formally, so I'll read it to you since you can't see it. Strategy is the ongoing quest to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. It involves a conscious plan to align the project with the opportunities and threats posed by the environment. Open source benefits from help in identifying opportunities and threats, as well as creating and executing a plan to achieve our goals. As a community, we need to be asking, what help do we need, and how do we make that happen? So here comes the heavy econ. Just warning you, take a drink or something. All right, so value chain analysis is a tool that businesses use to maximize competitive advantage. It helps people focus on the activities that significantly add value and thus give you a competitive advantage. It's ultimately a decision-making tool. When you consider its application to creating value within a community, or in Drupal's case, a community, usually it's used for a company. So the value chain presents the main value activities in our system. The primary activities along the bottom present a sequence from upstream to downstream, both supply and demand. The support activities span all of those primary activities. The support services for Drupal are the social and logistical fabric of our community. It's fiscal agency for local events like this one. it's organizing DrupalCons, it's community cultivation grants. Over the last several years, as a community, we've shifted much of the responsibility for these to the Drupal Association in support of local volunteers. The capacity we have done at the Drupal Association to take on these logistics has enabled the community to focus more on the product development that it does best, rather than setting up bank accounts everywhere and figuring out how to get insurance contracts. So moving on to the primary activities, procurement, right? So procurement is the first thing that has to happen. And for a software project, procurement is about getting the resources and requirements needed to build your thing, to make your product. It's the software equivalent of mise en place, right? For any of you who cook, right? You get all your stuff laid out before you even start cooking, right? It's user research. It's user experience design. It's architectural planning. It's initiative identification. It's feature requests. And of course, making sure we have the people needed to do it all. Then production, this is what we do best in the Drupal community. It covers the gamut of development from the first commit through bug fixing and release. This is where we are now. Then distribution. So distribution refers to all the inbound and outbound logistics. For us, this includes Drupal.org infrastructure and related projects like the Git migration and testbots. Again, we've largely transferred these responsibilities over to the Drupal Association, although we still rely heavily on a small number of volunteers who do absolute yeoman's work. Then sales. Seems really funny for me to be talking about sales in an open source community, but it's there, right? Drupal's obviously free. But what the sales means in terms of this model is actually creating the demand for Drupal through marketing and communication outreach. The Drupal community's time is best concentrated in production. Procurement, distribution, sales, and support activities are not the best use of volunteer time. To maximize our competitive advantage as a community, we need to shift those responsibilities elsewhere. So, in case you think I've forgotten, this is open source, right? So do we really need to be focused on competitive advantage? Like, really? Yeah, we do. So as a project matures, it no longer sees such large improvements from the contributions of programmers alone. Not all contributions are equally valuable, and the value of contributions vary over the life cycle of the release. With our limited resources, we need to be focused on maximizing the benefit for our contributors and creating the most value for our community. In using that value chain analysis, we actually can see where our opportunities are on the supply, demand, and support sides. So let's say we actually wanted to focus on this. How would we go about doing it? And disclaimer, this next section, these are my opinions. They are the things I am working toward. I am not speaking on behalf of the board right now, although I do think these things can and should, maybe will, happen. So let's think about it on the supply side, right? So let's cultivate the pipeline better. PHP isn't the hot new technology. We need to attract devs to work on Drupal. We need to focus on this both from the cost reduction side, making it easy and efficient to work with and to contribute to Drupal, and on the maximizing benefit side, making sure we have a strong, robust commercial ecosystem around it. When I started working in Drupal, it felt like most folks were in their 20s and 30s. Now it feels like most people are in their 30s and 40s. We need a steady stream of new, self-motivated members to keep our community thriving. We also know that underrepresented groups are not as able to participate in the do-ocracy that open source is built on. Right now, working in open source assumes you have free time. With enough free time, you can earn a reputation and unlock a high-paying career. However, free time is a luxury that many folks from underrepresented groups do not have. Our community is poorer for not being more diverse, and we need to make it a priority to increase opportunities for people to participate. It is well understood that diverse teams create better products, so it's in our interest to invest in improving the diversity of our community. Drupal needs to be built by the people who use it. Since we want everyone to use Drupal, everyone needs to be included in how we build it. Dries talked about Drupal as a public good in his State of the Drupal presentation in Amsterdam last fall. Like maintenance on road or bridges, there's just some work that we're better off doing centrally, with a little of everyone's financial participation. Funding work on core falls into that bucket, in my opinion. We need to train and fund beginners in apprentice programs. We need to provide targeted stipends for veteran contribs to make significant and innovative contributions, and we need to fully support maintainers and core committers. This, in combination with our move to semantic versioning, should help us arrive at a stable and predictable release schedule. We also need to focus on fostering community retention. If we focus on how we can better support the community we already have, we see a need for leadership development and succession planning. Many hands make light work, and our community norms need to allow devs to gracefully move in and out of leadership positions at any point in the development cycle, for long or short breaks. Relying on the same people until they burn out, or worse, burn their bridges, is neither wise nor sustainable. This approach would allow us to meet the long-term intrinsic incentives of our veteran community members. As part of our talent development and mentoring, which, by the way, we do very well, thanks to volunteers like Kathy and Andrea and the entire core mentoring team. And again, here's a plug for Sunday. Go to the sprints, it's great. We need a feedback system that stresses the competence of the contributor and provides detailed information and feedback on performance, such as a listing of achievements and extraordinary contributions. This emphasis on quality would enhance the reputational system that we already have. We also need to better understand our ecosystem. It would be great to know what our GDP is, our gross Drupal product, to measure the economic performance of our ecosystem over time. Who's contributing to Drupal? Who's using Drupal? What's the total financial footprint of the project? There's so much to be learned, and we are really, if anyone wants to do it, any academics in the audience, contact me. Let's do it. Then we also have connecting with the end users, right? So this is the supply demand side, right? We need to focus on connecting with those users. Drupal is a wonderful tool. We tend to focus on what it can be doing better. That's the itch again, right? We're all too close to it. We all know Drupal so well that we forget that not everyone is aware that what we have created is one of the best content management platforms on the market. Historically, most of the marketing has come as a byproduct of the efforts of the Drupal business ecosystem. Promoting your shop services also meant, in a little way, promoting Drupal. We're just now beginning to turn our attention to cultivating the demand for Drupal via the efforts of the marketing committee, the content working group, and the Drupal Association's Joe Saylor and his team. We've gotten this far without investing in marketing. Imagine, we're 2.5% of the web, and we really haven't done any marketing. So imagine what could happen if we actually did some. Could be cool. Our scratch your own itch ethos is actually really helpful in identifying some, if not many, of the needs of our end users. However, there is a persistent gap in end user participation in the community, which means that we need to take a different approach to identify user-focused features necessary to improve our user experience. This is crucial if we want to become the dominant CMS. If we want to be 10% of the web, we can't ignore this anymore. Connecting with current and potential end users through user research, user experience, and marketing investment is necessary to attract more end users. We are competing against a handful of technologically inferior commercial options with vastly superior marketing, user research, and user experience resources. We need to be competitive in these areas for Drupal to continue to thrive. And those areas are not strengths and not things that are well positioned for volunteerism. More end users creates more opportunities for devs and the commercial ecosystem, which in turn creates more contributors. This is the virtuous cycle of open source. Participation drives proliferation, proliferation drives participation. No system is perfect, and we need a constant injection of energy at strategic points to keep that cycle happening. Not just anywhere, but at the right place at the right time. A critical element to coordinating the value created through open innovation is some sort of underlying framework that connects the different pieces of knowledge together. This strategic level framework needs to exist and have a defined home within our project and be resourced in order to be effective. Without some sense of how all the various pieces come together, we cannot translate Drupal's technological awesomeness into useful solutions to real problems. By consolidating our collective knowledge in a strategic framework, we can produce superior products and services relative to those produced by a smaller number of minds huddled together in any single company. The strategic issue becomes how to capture and then sustain the created value without alienating the individuals, communities, or ecosystem members responsible for the continued development of Drupal. If we go back to the incentives that drive personal and organizational contribution, we see that the growth of the ecosystem, both at the end user and the developer sides, is necessary to continue to deliver the benefits that make sustained contribution possible. For every single one of these opportunities that the value chain analysis has revealed, I see an important coordination role best played by the Drupal Association. As we think about what the Drupal Association has the potential to be and the potential to do, I think it's really helpful to look at how the Linux Foundation works. The Linux Foundation promotes, protects, and standardizes Linux by providing unified resources and services needed for open source to successfully compete with closed platforms. In 2003, 38% of individuals carried out Linux-related programming during their regular work hours, although this was not an official duty. By 2014, 80% of Linux kernel developers do so as a part of their official role. As I mentioned earlier, in 2005, Linux instituted regular 2 to 3 month release cycles that deliver stable updates to Linux users. Each one of those updates has significant new features, added device support, and improved performance. Well over 80% of that development is demonstrably done by developers who are being paid for their work. The volume of contributions from unpaid developers has slowly declined for many years. It was 15% in 2012, then it was 14% in 2013, now it's under 12%. The reason for the decline in unpaid contributions is the success of Linux. There is high demand for Linux kernel developers, and they're likely to find a job. More than half of new Linux kernel developers are paid to work on the kernel from their very first patch. The response to the shortage of developers is to grow the talent in-house by the companies involved in Linux. The Linux Foundation tackles both the supply and demand side, supporting product development and marketing. It's fully funded and partially governed and operated by a commercial consortium that promotes the adoption of an operating system platform by developer users. So this is essentially how it works, right? You've got people who make money over here with the closed compliments. Then they become sponsors and engage with the community. They give money to the foundation board. They actually buy board seats. I'm really not advocating that. I'm really not cool with that, actually. And then they also provide staff to the core developer group. Then you've got your user contributors who also provide patches and bug fixes back to the core developer group, and they get feedback back and forth. And then you have the users who then fund by the products that closed compliments use, right? This is actually a pretty tight ecosystem, and it's been successful. Like, if you weren't paying attention, Linux won, right? This works, right? But I'm interested in what we learn from it without losing who we are. It's actually fairly similar to what we have in Drupal right now, except in a few key ways. As I mentioned, Linux has a strong corporate presence, both in funding, influence, and code in its ecosystem. By contrast, Drupal's ecosystem is driven by small businesses and independents. I am obviously biased, but I would like to see small businesses remain a powerful force in Drupal. I do welcome corporate participation. It would be great if some of the larger organizations that use Drupal were able to give back a little bit more, but I don't want that to be at the exclusion of the smaller concerns, independents, and freelancers who've helped Drupal to grow to be what it is. The Linux Foundation funds work on the Linux kernel. In the last release, Linux funded only about less than 1% of the actual changes to the kernel, but it paid those who reviewed over 15% of the changes, which makes them second only to Red Hat, who, if you're not familiar, Red Hat provides the largest distribution. They're a billion-dollar company supporting open source. They provide one of those closed compliments. So they have a pretty strong incentive to do so as well. The Drupal Association currently doesn't fund significant development or commits, but we do provide some supporting services. So that's why our little money line is dotted, right? We provide logistical support. We provide a lot of things. So Linux has found a way to wrangle a very large community of developers into frequent releases and a market-leading position. The Linux Foundation is, in my view, key to that. If Drupal wants to achieve that same level of success, there is much for us to learn, and the place is to start by better leveraging the Drupal Association. As a third-generation open source organization, the DA brings together companies as well as the community and promotes and facilitates a broad range of participation extending well beyond code production. Our focus is on structuring a productive ecosystem that develops the Drupal software and meets the needs of the community and beyond. Over the last several years, the DA has grown its capacity to take on most of the supporting and logistical activities that are most effectively done by centralized, dedicated resources. Currently, we maintain and improve Drupal.org, including over $100,000 every year just to host D.O and related services. We are fully committed to making sure that Drupal.org has the tools that we need. We organize 2 to 3 DrupalCons per year and fund scholarships for DrupalCon attendance to contributors. It's been over $160,000 over the last several years in scholarships. We coordinate global training days. There have been 341 training days sponsored or coordinated by the Drupal Association since 2012. We provide fiscal sponsorship to 29 camps, including this one, and we provided over $111,000 in community cultivation grants. 51 have been awarded. We have another $30,000 dedicated this year. All of our activities to date indirectly impact the project. While the association is doing more than it has ever done to support Drupal, it's actually not enough. It is everyone's job to make sure that the release of Drupal 8 is as successful as possible. That's why last November, we launched Drupal 8 Accelerate, a grant program designed to eliminate the release blockers for Drupal 8 due to the strategic impact this work has on the entire Drupal ecosystem. The D8 Accelerate Fund is run by the D8 branch maintainers who have voting rights on what to fund, and others with deep familiarity with the current status of Drupal 8. Its current membership is Dries, Angie Byron, Webchick, Nat Catchpole, Catch, Alex Pot, those are all the branch maintainers, Jess, XJM, and Alex Bronstein, Effulgencia. The Drupal Association does not play a role in the decision-making process, but rather plays a supporting and amplifying role by handling the tasks like logistics and fundraising. Through the program, we've made a small number of grants that have already had a huge impact. In fact, the fact that we're only at 50 release blockers right now between us and Drupal 8 is largely due to the impact that we've already seen since November. The association had already pledged $62,500 of our 2015 general operating budget as matching funds for any donations that come from the community. However, today I am proud to announce that the board has partnered with 7 awesome community supporters, Acquia, Appnovation, Lullabot, Palantir, Phase 2, Previous Next, and Wunderkraut to match the match and provide another $62,500 for the program, bringing us to $125,000 available in grants. That's pretty good. So now it's our turn as a community. We're asking you to help us raise another $125,000 to make the total amount available for these grants $250,000 this year. You can give knowing that every dollar you contribute is already matched by the association and anchor donors, doubling your impact. Your donations will allow us to make more grants faster, increasing our impact and getting Drupal 8 out the door. This is, make no mistake, an all-out, everyone-in effort to raise $250,000 to resolve these last release blockers. This is our moment. Together, we're going to move Drupal 8 from beta to release with the Drupal 8 Accelerate program. We already know it works. The D8 Accelerate grants have already tackled blockers related to menus, entity field validation, and caching. As a donor, you will always know what you funded because it's completely public. Drupal is a collaboration between its community, the association, and our business ecosystem, and first among those is community. Please join us today and make your donation. Please give what you can to support D8. These restricted funds will be used exclusively for the benefit of Drupal 8. Whether you're able to give $5, $50, $500, or $5,000, the impact of your contribution will be doubled and will be used to solve the highest priority task to get Drupal 8 launched. So my question is, what do you think we could raise at MidCamp, right? What do you think? Could we raise $2,500 here? $5,000? Whatever the amount, please, please, please show your support for Drupal 8 and help us begin to create a more sustainable contribution culture. And as a thank you, if you're not already a Drupal Association member, you'll receive a new 1-year Drupal Association membership for a donation at any amount.
Wow.
So with that, are there any questions?
I'm curious, for the systemic changes that you were talking about earlier to move towards a more Linux Foundation model, what sort of time frame are you thinking of?
I think Drupal 8 Accelerate is a pilot
Wait,
program.
you have to say the question.
Oh, sorry. The question is, give me a second. All right, so the question was, when I'm talking about systemic change within the Drupal Association, what does that time frame look like? And the answer is, so the Drupal Association is obviously looking at this, and we see the D8 Accelerate program as a pilot program. So we're going to judge how aggressively we move to adopt, to pursue some of the opportunities that I talked about based on how well we're able to do. Right? It's a significant change to our culture, right? To be able to fund work on core, right? And I think the whole point of my talk is that research shows us that there aren't enough natural incentives to make it worthwhile to do it the way we've done it to date, right? We're going to continue to suffer under our own success unless we change something. And so I think there's broad-based recognition of that, and we would like it to remain community-driven, right? If you look at the Linux Foundation, there are some pretty significant things I don't like about their model. The Linux Foundation membership, if you want to be a platinum member, it costs you $500,000, and you get a board seat for that. That is so not who we are, and that is not who I ever want us to become. So we need to find a way to do this with small donors. And if we learned anything from the Obama campaign, we know that small donations add up to have big impact. So that's what we're looking to do, is to see if we can create a sustainable financial model that would be necessary before we pursue any of those other initiatives. Yeah?
The Linux kernel has a relationship between tools that it uses, like glibc, or GCC, and pilot. For Drupal development, is there a relationship between contributing to, say, Symfony or PHP?
So the question is that there are other related projects that contributing for Linux impact Linux, and are there things that are there similar ways we can have impact by contributing to other communities? And as you noted in the question, yes. I mean, I would say that we are now very inextricably linked with the Symfony community and PHP as well. So if you've ever heard Larry Garfield talk, he talks a lot about getting off the island and how we have to work together. So we have, at the association, we actually have experimented with that. So Symfony co-located a conference with Drupal, and we had that big pass. And so we're constantly looking at other ways that we can provide mutual support, both logistically and financially, as well as in code, to those partners that we depend on.
We also have some questions on Twitter.
Okay, great.
So we've got a few questions on the Twitters. So one question, is D8's super long development cycle one of the main implicit reasons that the backdrop fork happened?
The question is the length of the release cycle for Drupal 8 one of the reasons that backdrop happened? You can ask Jen tomorrow, but I'm going to go and say no.
Okay. Another question is about the relationship with GitHub. Why aren't we on GitHub yet, and is that a possibility for moving in the future?
I love this question, and I think you should ask Jen tomorrow. So the question was, why aren't we on GitHub, basically, right? And I think you can, if you're familiar, issue queues are where things get done in Drupal. And if you move to GitHub straight up, you lose that. We have had significant discussions, deep discussions with GitHub. We followed very closely what WordPress was doing. So WordPress was looking to migrate over to to GitHub, and they've since backed off on that. There's just some very important parts of our community that would be lost if we did the integration where it stands right now. This is a big concern of ours. We're paying a lot of attention to it. And there are some ideas to improve the workflow within Drupal to make it more compatible and more familiar to folks used to the workflows in GitHub. So there are some changes that are planned, but nothing is ready to announce right now.
We'll take a few.
Okay, sure.
So with the, like you're talking about, there's more incentive for developers, small companies to work on the trip. How do you feel that is going to be affected with the increasing largeness of the core, potentially needing more workers where, at one point, obviously that shift is gone, but at one point there's talk of small core getting more smaller. Should we keep increasing the size of core with the idea that, maybe less and less incentive to people who work on the trip and have greater benefits to them personally?
So the question is, with the size of core increasing, and if we continue that trend, as core does more and more, will that undermine or start to erode the incentive for folks to work in the contrib space because core is doing more? I think that I agree with you that the ship has sailed, that core is not going to get smaller anytime soon. I think that there is an argument that many have made and that has carried the day that Drupal out of the box, without the reliance on contrib, needs to be more fully featured in order for us to be competitive in the market space, right? If we can address the release cycle time, it may be possible in several years for us to get to where Linux is, where most of the folks who work on core are funded. We're not there, and we are several years away from it. So we would be significantly down the road in the Drupal 9 cycle before we'd ever realize any potential gains like that. So I do think that for the foreseeable future, that contrib will continue to be the most attractive place for personal investment, right? Yes.
The model that you envision for the Drupal Association and the Drupal code, would or should that change the traditional role that the Drupal Association's had of not influencing development?
So the question is, with what I'm advocating for, with an increased role for the Drupal Association in providing direct support to Drupal core, would or should that change the historic tradition that the DA doesn't impact code, doesn't influence code? And my answer is actually, I don't think that it will. I don't think it has to. It could. It certainly could, right? If we started funding, if everybody who was an initiative lead was suddenly, hired by the association and had to do what we told them to do, right? But if you look at what we're doing with D8 Accelerate, we're providing the money, we're providing the strategic framework, but the strategy is still driven by the people it's always been driven by. We're just giving them better tools, more effective tools to be able to get done what we need to get done. So I'm not up here advocating in any way that the DA start to direct the project. I don't believe that that is good. I don't believe that's our wheelhouse. I don't believe that the research supports that at all. But I do think that there are, primarily financial and logistical things that a centralized organization does best. And that's what I want us to do. Yes?
Do you expect the financial impact would be to customers and clients who are using Drupal and potentially would have to pay for increased support costs with more releases coming out?
So the question is, what do I expect the impact, the cascade in the ecosystem to be if we had a more frequent release cycle for Drupal? Well, if you again look to Linux as a model, right, every release is stable and they are very clear about what's been changed, so you can choose to be on stable versions, and we would certainly have to support more than just the current version and the previous version, right? So semantic versioning does help us, and we would still have major versions and minor versions as they do in the Linux community, but there hasn't been, in Linux, that move to the more frequent release cycles hasn't driven up the costs or undermined the security and stability of releases that individuals are using. So I don't think I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it will necessarily be catastrophic, right? That suddenly the total cost of ownership of Drupal goes up because we're rolling features out faster. You still will have the option to not get them, right? Chris, you have a question?
Is Linux also a reference from a marketing, advertising, and awareness building standpoint for an open source platform that would be comparable to what you see from a proprietary selfish.
The question is, do I see the Linux Foundation as a model on the marketing and communication side? Absolutely, right? So if you look at the model we've followed traditionally by hosting DrupalCons and supporting local camps, I mean, that is very influenced by some of the moves that the Linux Foundation has made, but their presence at industry trade shows and hosting their own stuff, it is a model to us. And the more resources we have, the more we can do. So we're trying to see what kind of resources we can create without losing who we are. Yeah, Kathy.
So, tell me a little bit more about one of the ideas on your slides where you were talking about the paid internships.
Paid apprenticeships. So Kathy's question is talk a little bit more about paid apprenticeships. Pipeline development is a big problem, right? So PHP not inherently super cool anymore. We have the way that you have to have a lot of free time means that underrepresented groups aren't necessarily represented as much as they could be. They just don't have the free time. So one of the things that I've talked about and looked at other models is a 2 to 3 year apprenticeship program where someone comes in to the Drupal Association, is paid to work on core and/or Drupal.org to learn. Their skills are completely leveled up, and then we help them find a job at the end of it. They wouldn't become permanent staff. We don't actually. I don't think that the Drupal Association is best served by funding permanent staff, particularly for anything that would touch core. I think it's really important for us to be this kind of catalyst to help the change happen that we want to see in the community, right? We want to see younger developers. We want to see more diverse developers, and whether it's gender or race or globally, we need more people to be able to contribute. So let's accelerate that, right? So let's be a catalyst. Let's see that happen. So that's essentially the idea there. We've often focused, when we have injected support, we've supported the people who already have too much on their shoulders, right? And it's kind of our way. It's this notion of that social obligation, right? The reciprocity. You've done so much. We need to do that for you again, and we do. But we also need to cycle in new leaders. We need to mentor people up. We need to make it so that it's you don't have to go out in flames if you need a break, or that the core work doesn't have to grind to a halt because you can't get along anymore, right? Those things, we can't keep doing those things. All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.